Earlier in the program, when I was talking about Qantas's shambles at the moment, I was thinking as I was talking to Tony Sheridan how our government's made it so much harder for Qantas than it should have been. I mean, not only did they shut down, of course, all those international borders, but we had all those state border closures that shut down the airline industry in so many ways internally. And as you know, I railed against these border closures internally for 2 years. I thought they were disgraceful. And nowhere were they more disgraceful than in Western Australia, where Mark McGowan set up this fortress WA, said bugger off to the rest of the country, kept his own people in and shut everybody else out. Here's a little reminder of the sorts of things he was saying last year.
The reality is that if we were just to open the interstate border without restriction, lots of people would die. And so what I'm trying to do is save West Australian lives.
Yeah, do what I say or you die. It was that straightforward. Well, now, of course, Western Australia, they want everyone to go over there and empty their pockets and spend their money. And they've started this tourism blitz, this tourism advertising campaign. It's not very compelling. A lot of West Australians don't think much of it. See what you think. There you go. Head over to Western Australia, do some synchronised swimming under the ocean and have a look at a sky whale. Let's check in with David Penberthy, News Corp columnist and breakfast radio host at Adelaide's 5AA. Pembo, has that got you excited for a trek across the Nullarbor?
Well, I don't know about walking on a dream. I would have thought if the marketing people were going to abide by the strictures of truth in advertising, the slogan should be "Come back, please, all is forgiven." Because for 2 years, McGowan ran a pretty torrid sort of campaign of repulsion against the great unwashed east of the WA-SA border. And, you know, in all seriousness, I wonder whether a campaign like this would be regarded with contempt by tourism operators within Western Australia. I can remember last year when Stephen Marshall took what in political hindsight was the crazy brave decision to open the South Australian border on November 23. Now, clearly there was a jump in COVID cases before Christmas, but overwhelmingly, most South Australians at the time went, well, if we don't do it now, if we don't do it in January, if we don't do it in February, we're just going to be kicking the can down the road. Like, we've got to bite the bullet at some point. But when Marshall made that announcement, there was an immediate and huge influx of tourism to McLaren Vale, to the Coonawarra, to the Barossa. And I can remember ringing a guy called, his name was Jeff Anderson, who was a wine tour operator in the Margaret River. He hadn't had any customers for more than 18 months, like none, apart from a few people in Western Australia who were still travelling around. He said that 90% of his customers were from interstate and overseas, of them about 50-50, so 45% each. And he was saying he used to have like 8 drivers. He'd sacked 7 of them.
Yeah.
He was running the show himself. He'd sold 3 of his vehicles. So how are guys like that meant to go from a standing start now that Mark McGowan's come up with a jingle?
Yes, not a great jingle either. And this is the frustrating thing. You're always going to have to deal with this eventually. And WA did. Just ask the West Coast Eagles how that turned out for them with their footy season this year. Now, you've written a column about some of this this week as well, talking about what we need to learn from the pandemic and reminding us, of course, we've just got to not forget this. The twin cities of Coolangatta and Tweed Heads blocked off like the Berlin Wall. I mean, it's an outrage that we even contemplated that, yet it happened time and time again.
Yeah, I must admit, doing my column last week for the Sunday papers, I was just reflecting on the fact that it being Father's Day, it's actually hard to believe that it even happened in this country, that this time 12 months ago, the city of Coolangatta was getting sort of Formula One style orange plastic crash barricades erected down the main street to stop people from Tweed Heads coming over the border to say hi to their dads and their grandpas on Father's Day. And, they had an actual police operation around it where, to their credit, the police said, we're not going to be fining people, but if anyone is still doing this tomorrow, after Father's Day, hugging, holding hands, kissing, having illicit conversations with members of their own family, we will be moving in. You think about the extent of outlaw criminal motorcycle gang activity on the Gold Coast and what have you, and good to see that the resources were being wisely used at that time. It's just bizarre that so much of this stuff happened. And, I'm not a pandemic wacko. I'm pro-vax. I'm 4 times vaxxed. I don't think Bill Gates was using this to microchip our brains. But I do think that the extent to which state power vastly increased and so much of the bureaucracy felt that they could get away with telling 12-year-old boarding students, you're not allowed to see your mum and dad in the October school holidays, even though your farm's in the middle of nowhere, that level of state power should not be allowed to occur again. And I think it's worth looking at how far state power did increase.
Absolutely. The reaction was completely disproportionate to the threat. It went way too far, and we got to make sure it never, ever happens again. Not at least without some debate, some transparency. The thing was just the stroke of a pen from the likes of your mate Nicholas Spurrier and the others in the other states. So let's bring it back to the grassroots, mate. Let's bring it back to working families and true believers, and talk about the Midwinter Gallery Ball in Canberra last night. No doubt you've been at a few of those shindigs, like I have. I've supped at those shows. But honestly, they look so increasingly indulgent. And I thought the hypocrisy of Adam Bandt's wife, Claudia Perkins, and of course Sarah Hanson-Young herself, to actually turn up and indulge in the sort of corporate largesse and drink the bubbles and release the CO2 bubbles from their champagne into the atmosphere, but also stick a finger up with the slogans on their dress was not only unoriginal, it was just hypocritical and pathetic. Your thoughts?
Look, I must admit, I've been to that event once, and it's a bit like media award nights where everyone's sort of disingenuously congratulating each other for winning and then, running each other down the moment they turn around and walk away. I find the night kind of cringeworthy. I think the whole, broadly speaking, particularly in the middle of a cost of living crisis, it's a bit like those sort of off-the-record nights for the Washington Press Pack where the presidents get roasted and everyone's sitting there patting themselves on the back. I know it raises a lot of money for charity, but I sort of wonder if all the booze and outfits and food and the cost of hiring the room and everything else, like maybe they could just cancel it and give all the money to Beyond Blue or something like that, because it's got a real clubby insiders quality that I think most Australians would find quite repulsive. And the sort of Sam and Ralph relationship between the journos, the pollies and the lobbyists, I think sends almost borderline sinister signals in the minds of the average person who's not part of the political process. It looks like a private club.
Mate, you are so spot on. Yeah, I reckon I went to 2 or 3 of them in various capacities. If you recorded everything that goes on at that event or just wrote a tell-all factual account of the Midwinter Ball, the public would just would turn away from politics even more dramatically than they are at the moment. But there's an interesting counterpoint here because I want to go to a first speech, a maiden parliamentary speech that I looked at earlier in the program from a South Australian Senator, Kerrynne Liddle. And if that's politics out of touch, the Midwinter Ball, I think Kerrynne Liddle is really prospective for getting some grassroots common sense into the Senate. Here's a little bit of her speech yesterday.
I get angry when others seek to define me firstly or only by race, and I know from experience it is getting worse. I was not an Indigenous news reporter, nor an Indigenous businesswoman, or an Indigenous company board director. I had the same qualifications and experience as everybody else. First and foremost, I am just me.
Yeah, Senator Kerrynne Liddle in her first speech yesterday. Pembo, she's going to be a real asset. Her life experience and her straightforward approach, I think, is going to be fantastic to watch.
I think she's a really impressive person, Chris, and I've met her a few times now. I had a coffee with her about a month ago down the road here at Adelaide Uni and did a piece about her for The Australian. And, you know, I think the thing that I really like about her is she tries not to be doctrinaire. She's a very pragmatic, sort of results-based person, and her own private life, and I heard Anne Ruston before talking about the fact that she's not only a mother by birth to her own 2 children, but she brought up 2 foster children as well, one of whom had alcohol fetal syndrome when he was born, and he studied hard. He's now, I think he's got a job in horticulture. She's a real success story, and it's because her parents, who she went and visited in Alice Springs on a road trip only a few weeks ago, she wanted to clear ahead before she embarked on the big Canberra adventure. So she drove just a few 100 kilometres up the road from Adelaide to Alice Springs and back again. But her parents, they were obsessed with her and her 3 siblings getting an education. And, you know, I mean, she's anti-voice, which I've discussed that with her. I'm not against voice, and I know you're not either. But the one point that I think she makes that's hugely important is if we're going to do things like have a voice, it's got to mean something. It's got to be linked to what are the things we're trying to change and achieve, and what are the benchmarks that we're going to put in place so that we don't just stand around feeling good about ourselves. So I like that steely-eyed sort of focus she's got on no waffle and more action, and I think she's going to be an asset to the parliament.
Yeah, I think you're spot on, and you're spot on about the voice too. You know, I'm a strong supporter, but only if it's practical, only if it is actually focused and can deliver practical good, because the symbolism is just not worth it. Yeah. It's just a stunt. Let's segue then to another very famous Indigenous Australian woman, and that is Cathy Freeman. She's back in the news today, not because of anything Cathy has done, but because of her young daughter and a stunning performance captured on video in suburban Melbourne. Have a look. Cathy Freeman's young daughter just blitzing the field there. We haven't got her name, and her name is Ruby, actually, I've been told. And I don't know whether there's a lot of pressure on a kid being the daughter of such a famed Olympic champion, but she's certainly fleet of foot.
Some of these kids, though, and when you've got the genetic advantage of having Cathy Freeman as your mum, you've got a pretty massive head start. I can remember a few years ago, my son was playing in a school Aussie Rules Carnival here, and one of the sides he came up against was a Port Adelaide school team, and they had the 2004 Norm Smith medalist Byron Pickett's son in the team, and I went over to my son who was standing and I said, "Mate, that's you stuff then," and he just rolled his eyes, and I think this kid got about 48 touches on him. You know, it's just one of those things. But yeah, we've got to find out a name and watch out for her at Olympics in the future, because she's certainly got the Ruby, the genes for it.
Ruby is, yeah. I've got to tell you, I made the mistake of going to one of my son's Father's Day breakfast the other day, and the other father who spoke there was a former Olympian, a 4-time Olympian who's married to an Olympian, and I got my son home afterwards and felt that I'd let him down because, you know, playing a few games for the Athelston Footy Club, it's not going to cut it for him.
No, it's hard to get the young boys too excited about a life spent writing columns for newspapers, isn't it? You know, there's a reason that people like you and I don't appear on bubblegum cards, mate.
Absolutely. Now, I reckon we might just about wrap it up there, Pembo. Thanks for joining us. Appreciate your time.
Good on you, Chris.